Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Hope all of you are doing well and staying safe. This is Edward Ahmed Mitchell with Muslim Network TV. Thank you for joining us. Let's dive right into the discussion. Today is March 15th. As many of you may know, it is the first UN recognized International Day to combat Islamophobia. The UN General Assembly last year voted to commemorate this day going forward, and so this is something that is being recognized by many countries around the world and many Muslim organizations around the world. March 15th marks 4 years since the Christchurch massacre, when a white supremacist and anti-Muslim extremist walked into two masajid in New Zealand and opened fire, killing 51 Muslim men, women, and children. May Allah grant them all the highest rank of paradise. And that act of anti-Muslim bigotry, as you all know, was not an isolated incident. Anti-Muslim bigotry is manifesting all around the world in different ways, from here in the United States to China to Burma and France and so many other places. So to discuss this day, this commemoration, what it means, what we can do about global anti-Muslim bigotry, and how our nation can do something about global anti-Muslim bigotry, let's bring on our special guest, Dr. Maha Hilal, who is the Executive Director of Muslim Counterpublics and a noted author, including the author of Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, The War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience since 9/11. Assalamu alaikum, doctor. How are you?
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you so much for having me on the show today.
Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. So, first, Dr. Lal, so tell us a bit about Muslim Counterpublics Lab. I want to hear about that and the work you're doing there, and then we'll dive into the discussion of International Day to Combat Islamophobia.
Yeah, absolutely. So the mission of Muslim Counterpublics Lab is to disrupt and subvert dehumanizing narratives that are designed and deployed to justify state violence against Muslims. The idea of this organization is to really push back and to stand in opposition to many of the problematic and demonizing narratives that have been perpetuated, well, created and perpetuated throughout the course of the War on Terror, and again, per the mission, that have been used specifically for the state to deploy in service of justifying state violence.
Understood. That is a heavy lift, and alhamdulillah, we're glad that you are taking that on through this organization. So, Dr. Al, let's talk about the International Day to Combat Islamophobia. First, just generally, this word, there's some debate about it. Should it be Islamophobia, anti-Muslim bigotry, anti-Muslim racism? Just let's talk about the word itself. What does Islamophobia mean to you? How do you define it? And then also, what are your thoughts on this day, this commemoration, International Day to Combat Islamophobia? Good, bad, helpful, window dressing? What are your thoughts?
So, I don't think there's a perfect term to describe, what we're essentially speaking about, right? The phenomenon of Muslims facing abuse and targeting, not only by the state, but society as well. The reason I typically use Islamophobia when I'm referring to this phenomenon is because I think it's really important to recognize and hone in on the particulars of anti-religious animus, which is about the ways in which Islam and Muslims are constructed as a threat. Now, more broadly, when I think of the term, and this is something I look at specifically and examine in my book, when I think of Islamophobia, a lot of definitions will talk about Islamophobia as a fear, right? An irrational fear. And I don't think it's irrational. I think it's contrived. Because if you look at the ways in which Muslims have been constructed, it's actually quite rational that people would fear Muslims, and that's precisely the point. And Islamophobia is really about cementing these particular constructions of Islam, right, and Muslims as violent, barbaric, uncivilized, and opposed to normative democratic values. And the idea is to push Muslims outside of moral boundaries that are extended to other communities, such that it becomes okay to target, abuse, murder, torture, detain, and kill Muslims.
I think, Dr. Hall, you made an excellent point there. I mean, the fact that, people do have some fear of Muslim, but as you noted, kind of contrived. I mean, if I wasn't a Muslim and I had no Muslim friends and all I know about Islam was what I hear politicians say or see on cable news at night, I might be afraid of Muslims too, right? And so there are a lot of people who are not bad people. They don't have hate in their heart, but they've just gotten very deliberately a lot of bad information, and that leads them to support some very unjust policies here and abroad. So what do you think about the day to International Day to Combat Islamophobia? Is this helpful in the fight to raise awareness about and counter anti-Muslim bigotry. What are your thoughts about it?
Well, let me just backtrack a minute, because when I say that the fear is contrived, I don't necessarily mean that it should or can be used as an excuse for people not to learn about Islam and Muslims and not to really do the work to understand who this community is. And so I think that that's an important distinction because it's not letting them off the hook. Now, in terms of this International Day to Combat Islamophobia, obviously, like many things that are taken up by the UN, it is a symbolic gesture. I think there are some benefits, right, to, you know, elevate the discourse on Islamophobia and the idea that there is systemic targeting of Muslims. On the other hand, though, um, I was looking at the statement, or the speech, rather, I think, that was made by the US ambassador, not exactly sure what her name is offhand. And she specifically said that they're committed, the US is committed to addressing anti Muslim hatred. And we know that's categorically false. The US is not committed to that. And even if there are some initiatives that they're pursuing to combat Islamophobia, they're still at the same time justifying and targeting Muslims specifically because they're Muslims. The whole entire apparatus of the war on terror has been entrenched with Islamophobia. So I mention this because when we talk about this day, again, on the one hand, it's elevating the discourse. On the other hand, it's allowing countries like the United States to whitewash their violence and to give people the perception that they're doing something about this phenomenon of the targeting of Muslims, which they're absolutely not.
So, Dr. Lal, that begs the next question, which is if a people want to demand that their government take this day seriously and actually change something about what they're doing in relation to Muslims and anti-Muslim bigotry, whether that's the United States, China, et cetera. We're in America, so the question falls to you: what should the United States government be doing differently if they are serious about addressing anti-Muslim bigotry, that is here and also is contributing to and being used by anti-Muslim bigots around the world?
Well, they should work to dismantle the numerous laws and policies of the war on terror that have been deeply entrenched in Islamophobia, right? We're not just talking about theoretically ending the global wars, whether it's Iraq and Afghanistan, which really haven't ended, but it's about surveillance, right? It's about federal terrorism prosecutions. It's about detention and torture. And, even when the wars end, even when the United States claims, right, to be sort of pulling back on a war or restricting a certain policy, right, or withdrawing, for example, NCERs, right, that doesn't mean that Islamophobia has gone away. And because they specifically don't address Islamophobia, it won't go away. And they're not naming it as a problem. They're not naming it as central. And if you don't do that, then you're under really no pressure to eliminate what is the source of all of this. And the United States knows that. I mean, I've been working on Guantanamo Bay prison for many years, and to even get progressives and liberals to acknowledge that the entire prison post 9/11 was filled with Muslim men was a big feat because people perceive largely the war on terror and the targeting of Muslims as either accidental or coincidental. And that specifically stems from the ways in which the United States government has portrayed the war and has tried to evade responsibility for the abuse and targeting of Muslims.
So one of the interesting things, Dr. Lal, is how we've noticed some other governments that are targeting Muslims using some of the same rhetoric that not only anti-Muslim hate groups in America use, but that the government at least once used: radical Islamic terrorism. This is just security. We're protecting the border. We're making sure there's no radicalism. I think of China and how they justify what they're doing to Uyghurs, the Indian government and how it justifies what it allows to happen. Can you talk about that? Is the Islamophobia that kind of not originated here, but was weaponized here by actors and within our country and our government, is that going overseas, contributing to bigotry overseas, or are these kind of separate moles that are coming up by whack-a-mole by themselves? What do you think?
I mean, Islamophobia is a global phenomenon, right? It predates 9/11, I would say, in every country, right, in which there's the targeting of Muslims. I think what the war on terror did, however, was to create a blueprint. So it wasn't just about people joining in, allies joining in U.S. efforts to fight this war on terror. it was also about providing this template that other countries across the globe could use on their own communities and citizens and countries, right? The rhetoric of terrorism and the specific weaponization of terrorism, what constitutes a terrorist, right? What makes state violence more moral than non-state actor violence? All of these things, in the specific ways that they have been weaponized in the war on terror, have been tools that other governments have deployed, whether you're looking at the Philippines, whether you're looking at China, whether you're looking at Israel. All of these countries obviously have had Islamophobia, but it's this use of the tools that the war on terror specifically provided, I think, that has allowed it to escalate in a particular way.
So, Dr. L, there's some indication that that Congress might finally end the authorization for the Iraq War 20 years after the fact. Too little, too late. Is this one of the policies or laws that, if ended, will have some positive practical effect on limiting, what our government is doing overseas? I don't know if you're following that issue, but any thoughts you want to share on that?
Well, I'm sure you know that I'm very cynical and skeptical. Um, so,
It's okay. So
I
someone's got to
mean,
do. Someone's got to be there. The watchdog. Yes, absolutely.
so I mean the AUMF, or the authorization for use in force in Iraq. I mean, they can be withdrawn, they can be overturned, whatever. They can pass legislation to sunset both or either, right? Um, but we also know the United States tends to do whatever it wants, and the Iraq War. I mean, if there wasn't that resolution, would it not have happened? I highly doubt the answer is no. I think it would have happened regardless. And that's the thing, right? The United States sometimes uses laws as a tool through which to justify its violence, but then it's just doing legal gymnastics. And then, in the absence of those pieces of legislation, laws, policies, etc., it will still do whatever it wants. So I'm not hopeful that that will really make a huge difference. I mean, it might give Congress more power to push back against executive authority. But I mean, again, like the Iraq War, I mean, the United States unilaterally, pretty much unilaterally launched that war and disregarded international law, domestic law, and did whatever it wants. So I think that that's a huge problem. And in regards to the 20-year anniversary, I mean, it's not just about getting rid of that, the AUMF and the resolution on Iraq. It's about compensation. It's about acknowledging the harm, right? I mean, we have to mainstream the idea that the Iraq War was based on a lie. Some people know that. Most people don't know that. And really rectify the damage. And when we talk about justice, justice is not what the United States decides is justice. Justice should be about what Iraqis want. What do they want from the United States government after a war that destroyed their country, killed numerous people, detained people, tortured people? So it has to be up to the Iraqis to make the demands, right? And the United States needs to heed those demands, because this is about justice. It's not just about the US deciding when a war is over, because US wars just don't end, right? And even when it says they end, they don't end. They're amorphous. And so people can't move on with their lives. And I'll just say one more thing, which is that, one of the examples I always bring up when I talk about US wars ending is a congressional hearing where this young Pakistani boy said that he prefers gray skies over blue skies, right? Because when the skies are blue, there are drones. And to me, a war is only over if kids like this young boy in Pakistan can look at the sky and not associate that with state violence. That, to me, is when we can legitimately say a war is over.
Let us not forget some of the worst drone attacks that killed civilians didn't even occur in the Bush administration, which we all think of when we think of the horrors of the war on terror. They occurred, sadly, during the Obama administration, and continued into the Trump administration. So, Dr. Al, final thoughts. So, as we move on from this day, and everyone's talking about Islamophobia and highlighting it and all that. That's good. But going forward, what would you advise Muslim organizations? I'm part of a Muslim organization. You are as well. What do we need to be focusing on as this upcoming election approaches? As we're able to start making demands upon people who might be running for a different office. What would you advise Muslim organizations and activists they should be focusing on if they want to make some sort of dent in anti-Muslim bigotry, structural anti-Muslim bigotry in this country?
Well, I first think that there has to be a lot less complacency, and I think there has to be a more confrontational
Mm.
approach. We tried under Obama to be, to hope that he would change things for the better, right? To use positive rhetoric, right? To really engage with the government, probably still under Trump. But that really hasn't worked much. Okay. And so at this point, it's like, what are we going to do that's different? One of those things is to build political power, because obviously Muslims have very little, which means that they have very little sway on what the government does. And two, really pushing for and stop being apologetic calling out the violence that this country continues to inflict on Muslims. And there's a lot of acquiescence in our community, as I've often spoken about. There's a lot of acquiescence. There's a lot of supporting and sort of like clapping our hands for the bare minimum that the US government does. And that's not okay at this point, right? If we want our rights, like no one is going to give us our rights, right? We have to demand our rights. And that's just something that we know throughout the course of American history. The United States government isn't going to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. They're going to have to do the right thing because we are putting pressure. We are being confrontational, and we are saying we refuse to be dehumanized and targeted by the state any longer. So, I don't do a lot of advocacy work necessarily on the Hill, right? So there has to be an inside outside strategy. And I think primarily though it's about really being confrontational, right? And it's not a bad thing. Confrontational just means to be assertive about your rights, right? To not compromise your humanity, to not say it's okay to treat us like this, right? Or it's okay if the Muslim ban, only targets these countries but not these countries, right? Or it's okay if the terror watch list, I know this was one of the cases that CARE took on. It's okay if they target non-Americans, but we want to make sure that Americans are safe. That's not okay, right? We're here to advocate for the categorical acceptance and acknowledgement, right, of Muslim rights. And we have to be steadfast about that and really come together and be unequivocal about the fact that Muslims have rights.
Absolutely, absolutely, Dr. Hall. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate that. As you noted, power concedes nothing without a demand, as we all
Okay.
know. So, thank you for joining us today on this International Day to Combat Islamophobia, sharing your perspective on these important issues. We look forward to having you back, inshallah, in the future. Until then, assalamu alaikum. May Allah grant you a successful Ramadan.
Thank you so much, and wa alaikum assalam.